Hello, my name is James Trost, and this is A2 Insight. Today's guest is Mr. Neel Hajra, the Chief Executive Officer of the Ann Arbor Area Community Foundation.
Well done. That's a long name to
Well,
remember.
Neel, welcome to A2 Insight.
Thanks, Jim. I appreciate it.
You bet. We're glad to have you here. Neel, to start out, we want to learn a little bit more about you, your background and growing up. So why don't you let us know where you went all the way to probably until your academic career ends?
Yeah, sure. So I'm an Ann Arbor boy through and through. I was born in the old women's hospital, have lived here my whole life.
Okay.
Spent a year abroad when I was 5 because both my parents came from India to the States, my dad in the 50s, so a long time ago, my mom in the 60s. So here's the cool part of the story. My dad went to graduate school at Northwestern, then became a professor of biochemistry at Michigan. My mom came to study at MSU. So when they met, fell in love, and got married, they actually broke 2 taboos in the 60s. The first was it wasn't an arranged marriage. They had the audacity to fall in love and get married. And the second was it was a Wolverine and a Spartan who decided to get together. Okay. And so then my older brother was born in the late 60s, and then me in the early 70s, both in Ann Arbor. He's since moved to the East Coast, but I've lived here ever since. And then growing up, like a lot of immigrant families, it was all about school and academics and hard work and all those good things. And but I was always a jack of all trades. I didn't just want to be good at science or just be good at one subject. So I liked a lot of things, and music was a big part of my life. So by the time I got to college, I went to University of Michigan, and it was great to go to a school whose football games I'd been walking to my whole life. And I kept following that track of let me do everything I can. And I'll never forget the conversation my junior year with my college counselor saying, you realize you have to declare a major, don't you? And I said, okay, well, physics is pretty interesting. So I chose it not because I wanted to be a physicist by any stretch, but you know, my dad's in science, I had a scientific interest, and it was a curious subject. So I ended up going 5 years undergrad, majoring in physics with no plans to be a physicist. And so then I did what a lot of aimless people do after undergrad. I went to law school. It happened to be at Michigan again. Got my law degree, and then my professional career started. Yeah.
Well, and the professional career, I believe, began as an attorney with Ford Motor Company. Is that right? Or
yeah, that's right. Actually, it was a really great transition. I'd worked there for a summer in law school, and then they were one of the companies that hired law students straight out of law school. So I joined the Office of General Counsel and worked in Dearborn, but I stayed in Ann Arbor. So I lived right by a 94 exit, commuted to Dearborn every day, and I was on the transactional side. So I was in world headquarters working on acquisitions and contracts and more transactional things like that. We had 2 other buildings that had all the litigators, but that wasn't my cup of tea.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, at some point, you decided it was time to move away from the corporate attorney world and move on to a totally different trajectory in your life, and that was to move out of that. And then what happened after you decided to leave Ford in your law career?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think I'm a good case study in never having a career plan. So, I spent 3 years at Ford Motor Company, and I learned a ton about business, about the law, about sort of how enterprise is done, and watching a Fortune 5 company with a ton of talented people. What I realized was I didn't want to do that for 20 or 30 years. The experience was good, but I knew it wasn't for me in the long term. So what happened was it was a stroke of luck. My former boss at Ford Motor Company, Susan Katz-McFall, had left the year prior to reboot a nonprofit called the New Center, or Nonprofit Enterprise at Work. She and I were talking, and she suggested I come work with her for a year, and our deal was I could find my next real job, I'll put that in air quotes, while I worked with her at the nonprofit. So I ended up taking a sabbatical from Ford Motor Company for a year. I went to work with my buddy Susan. And here was where really I stumbled into something amazing. This was back in 2001. I started waking up really excited every day to go to work. And so I ended up not networking. I ended up just embracing my role at the New Center. And ended up being there for almost a decade, first working with Susan, and then when she moved on as the CEO.
And what was it about the New Center that was getting you up early in the morning that was so appealing for you at the time? What was your role there specifically that was different from what you had done previously?
Sure. So a couple of things really went through my head that I hadn't really thought about before. So first of all, it was really rewarding to be working with so many community groups that I knew about. I've lived here my whole life and admired all these great nonprofits, and all of a sudden I was on the other end of the conversation trying to make those nonprofits more effective, because NEW's mission is to help other nonprofits succeed. We ran an office building that hosted nonprofits. We had multiple consulting services for nonprofits. And then my sweet spot in my first few years is I worked IT jobs in college at the hospital system. So I had an IT background. Didn't have a degree, but I had a lot of experience there, and I had learned how to do websites. So my first job at NEW was to revamp a website development program. And it was this great visceral, sort of, you had an end product. You had nonprofits who at the time, this was a long time ago, didn't even have websites. And so that was really rewarding to really get into the nitty-gritty. And then from there, I slowly expanded my work and became the chief operating officer, overseeing a lot of new services. And then by the time I left NEW, our specialties were an IT support service, not just websites, but the IT infrastructure, and also governance consulting. And by then, we'd also expanded outside of Washington County into Southeast Michigan. And so it was a really exciting time, but then the Community Foundation came calling, and I realized that would be an even cooler platform to support local nonprofits.
Right, well, and I think that's where we want to focus on this, is the whole idea and the concept of nonprofits in the community, and the nonprofit sector as a larger. We really have three sectors in our society: the government sector, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector. For those of you not familiar, you can certainly find NEW. It's kind of hidden, ironically. If you're on your way out up to 23, just go out Main Street and you'll see this kind of like castle-like building right on the banks of the Mississippi. That's where the new center is located. What is it about, what you think of nonprofits? A nonprofit organization, by definition, it means that the motivation is hopefully some kind of worthiness, I guess, which is external to profit. What would you say is, having worked at NEW, why do people as general begin nonprofit organizations?
Sure. So I think it's worth taking a step back and observing that the nonprofit and philanthropic sector in the U.S. is by far the largest in the world, probably by a factor of 2 over the United Kingdom, which is where there were the first sort of official codified nonprofits.
And why do you think that is? Why?
Yeah, sure, for a couple of reasons. First of all, there is a correlation between the less that the public sector does, the more the private sector fills in roles. And in the U.S., you have a second factor, which is we're an incredibly wealthy nation, relatively speaking. So there's enough private market capital to actually pursue public good, not just through the government, like some Northern European countries do, but also what I like to call the nonprofit sector is it's really private action for public good. And the U.S. is the epitome of private enterprise, and so it's no surprise that we also have the largest sort of for-benefit sector in the world as well. And so the nature of the nonprofit sector actually is bigger than most people think. In Michigan, the sector employs 9% of the Michigan workforce is in charitable nonprofits. Nationally, nonprofits consist of 5% of the U.S. GDP, which is actually an incredibly massive number and bigger than a lot of industries. And so in one sense, we think of the traditional smaller nonprofits, and yet over the last 40 years, the sector has grown immensely in size, which makes it a really interesting place to be doing work. Going back to your question, I think the reason people start nonprofits is because they often see the government as perhaps not the kind of solution they view as being nimble or responsive. And I think a lot of people in the government would agree. The pace of government is bureaucratic and slower than the private sector. And so the nonprofit sector ends up being ideally the sweet spot between private, nimble action and yet with a public good in mind. And you're right that the ultimate goal of a nonprofit is to generate public good. But what I'd say is folks should think about it sort of as a double bottom line. You have to attend to the financial bottom line in order to promulgate your mission. And so even though the sector is called the nonprofit sector, any healthy nonprofit should actually be generating a profit every year. That's the only way for private enterprises to maintain growth, to stay nimble, to be able to pursue new opportunities, and to basically maximize their impact.
Well, one of the complaints against nonprofits is they're not very accountable. It's a fairly bureaucratic process. You have to fill out an endless variety of forms. You're supposed to have board meetings, board notes, constantly having improvement. People may want to say, well, I want to, my kid died of cancer and I want to start a foundation. Well, that's not easy, but I guess that would be my question to you. Then this is still why you're working for it, because it defines itself as an incubator, because it isn't just going in and saying, if I want to start a business, I can just go down the street and pay $35 and I'm a business.
Sure.
It's not the case with a nonprofit. Could you kind of just give our folks just an idea of what is involved? And I guess we'll use this fictitious, I've got a certain amount of money and I'd like to start a nonprofit, and I came to New at this point. This
Sure.
is still while you're at that career. How would your organization help me develop a nonprofit organization?
Sure, and although it's been 8 years since I've been at New, definitely I'm still asked this question all the time, being with the Community Foundation. And so I'll try to give you the very brief answer, but you know, Jim, it's pretty complex. So, you know, a nonprofit is actually a state corporation that then receives federal tax status. So the first few steps involve creating that state corporation, having a founding board, getting your articles of incorporation approved by the state. That's all very easy to do, and there's very little scrutiny by the state. It's almost like you just check some boxes, fill in some blanks, and there you go. So going back to your question of accountability, the first real accountability, the state level action is pretty straightforward, but then the real designation you need is tax exemption by the IRS. So actually what people don't realize is the IRS is the gatekeeper for defining who is doing public good and who isn't. And while it is bureaucratic, that actually speaks to the accountability that you referred to. It's intended to be a filter to make sure that only those truly conducting public good and not private benefit are approved for the nonprofit status. So the most complicated phase is getting that tax exempt status. Once you have that status from the IRS, which can take 6, 12, or even more months, then you go back to the state and then get some state tax exempt statuses based on that federal tax exemption. And then, like you said, that's just your startup. Now you need a board, maybe you need a staff, maybe it's all volunteer to start. Then you've got to start thinking about, well, where's my money going to come from? Because most nonprofits don't generate their income from the services they provide. And believe me, it's complex and it's tough. So even smaller nonprofits, what I really admire about them is people don't appreciate what complex enterprises nonprofits are. We see the end result as a brochure or an event or an ask for support. What a lot of us don't see are there are a lot of steps to maintain an above-board nonprofit. I think it's fair to question, because of some high-profile cases, whether the nonprofit sector has been abused for private benefit. And I've got a couple of thoughts on that. The first is the answer is yep, sometimes it is. Anytime you deal with the tax code and tax benefits, you're going to see people engaging in either fraud or abuse or other ways of leveraging a tax vehicle for private gain. That's where enforcement comes in. And you referred to it, and you're right. Enforcement is relatively lax in the nonprofit sector. There's 2 governmental entities that are really in charge of it. The state attorney general's office in every state. So the Michigan Attorney General, the job is to ensure nonprofits are running for public benefit. And then the IRS's job is to make sure nonprofits are appropriately receiving tax beneficial status because of their public good mission, and they receive annual reports from nonprofits who do that through their tax returns. But let's be real, the IRS and the Attorney General's offices only focus on the very big cases. I've always been an advocate for more enforcement because the nature of our sector calls for trust. And so every high-profile case where someone's gamed the system or created a fake nonprofit or taken an absurd salary, that sets the entire sector back, because without trust, we really don't have any kind of traction. And we can't achieve our missions without trust. So I, for one, would actually vote for greater oversight, more enforcement, and then the last thing I'll mention is groups like the Ann Arbor Area Community Foundation are another important check and balance. So you or I as individual donors don't have the time to do a deep dive into 5 years of tax returns and analyzing the leadership structure of a nonprofit and how they operate. Luckily, that's why our foundation exists, one of the reasons, and so we do a lot of due diligence. So folks in this community can rest assured that the nonprofits we're granting to have been vetted very deeply, and therefore there's another layer of accountability there that that we offer to the community.
Well, and that's really where I want to take this, is to what you're currently doing, and that would be what the area, the Ann Arbor area, which I assume it means it encompasses more than just Ann Arbor, Community Foundation. A foundation, what is the mission of the Ann Arbor Area Community Foundation? We've learned about nonprofits. I get the foundation, the assumption is that you have resources that you are utilizing to invest, I guess would be a term that you would use, or at least subsidize certain worthy organizations. So could you tell us why you decided to leave NEW to join the Ann Arbor Area Community Foundation, and what is the mission of this organization? How does it rank up with other similar organizations in the state?
Sure, I'm happy to. So the mission of the Ann Arbor Area Community Foundation is to enrich the quality of life in Washtenaw County. Way back in 1963, residents of the county decided that we needed an organization to host permanent charitable funds that provide unending perpetual support to great local nonprofits. So here's the great part of the story. Since 1963, our foundation has distributed over $50 million locally in grants and scholarships to support great nonprofits. There's really three ways you can look at what we do. Our most unique characteristic is that we're the only organization that holds permanent charitable funds that broadly serve the community in Washtenaw County. The second thing we do, so we hold those funds, we're a financial institution in that sense. We're also a platform for philanthropy, so we partner with donors to help them magnify their impact and honor their legacies through permanent funds. The third thing we do is we partner with nonprofits, because frankly, we're a source of capital, but it's nonprofits that do the hard work of turning our support into impact. It's a critical relationship between us and the grantees that we support. And then the fourth thing we do is we partner with other community institutions. So we very rarely work in a vacuum. We and other institutions in the Ann Arbor area and in Washtenaw County, a lot of us believe that our impact is so much greater when we magnify each other's work rather than working in silos. And so I guess that my last observation is we are unique in Washtenaw County in terms of being based here and being a host of 550 permanent charitable funds. However, there are 800 community foundations around the country. There's over 60 in Michigan. So we are not an uncommon model throughout the country, but we are really Washtenaw County's primary source of permanent charitable capital.
And that's interesting. So let's take it from, we've learned how nonprofit organizations can get started. We have that option here at NEW as an incubator, as a place for people to get a sense of it. And then let's say I've started a successful charity or a philanthropic endeavor.
Congratulations.
Thank you. With all all entails in dealing with the IRS and the state and all the other, and getting a board and a functioning board.
And finding donors.
And everything else.
And doing your job well. And all of those things, right?
Right. But then I figure, well, let's see, we've been around for 10 years. We feel we're contributing to the community. Where do you fit into that? Or how would I, as an organization, contact you to because I need more resources? How would I approach an organization like AAACF to see if I might be worthy of your recognition in a financial way?
Sure, it's a great question. And again, if I were quarterbacking this for a nonprofit, my first answer is start with individual support. And here's why. Although foundations get a lot of media attention, the individual philanthropic market is much, much larger. In fact, I believe it's nearly 80% of all philanthropy nationally is conducted by individual donations. Foundations are, I believe, less than 15% of total philanthropy. And yet, if you read the paper or the websites, you'd believe that foundations like us are the primary driver of philanthropy, and that's just not true. So any successful nonprofit, and I'm overgeneralizing, would start building their base of income by having many individuals supporting it. That's sort of like Sustainability 101. When you have that baseline, that's actually the best time to talk to us. What we can do is we can enhance the support that you have. Sometimes we help launch new programs, provide temporary support when there's a need. And then to go to your question, what nonprofits do is, first thing they do is they go to our website, aaacf.org, because on our website it lists our literally dozen or more different grant programs, because how we distribute funds is generally through competitive grants. Those aren't done just by me or staff. Those are actually done through community committees. So since '63, not only have we distributed those $50 million, it's through ongoing community input. We are a foundation that's very much by the people and for the people. So then what happens is once a nonprofit identifies grant-making programs that seem to fit, so let's say you were in the education, you're an education nonprofit, you've been operating for 10 years, and then you see a couple of grant programs that seem to fit the kind of goals that we have. So for example, we have a youth council that grants out over $80,000 a year. Education is definitely one of their areas. So instead of writing an application and fast forwarding to that step, then what a nonprofit would do is they'd contact us. So this is the beauty of a community foundation, right? We're not in some ivory tower, separated from everyone else. We're at community meetings. We're constantly engaging. And so what we want to do is we want to give nonprofits guidance on how to put their best foot forward with us. Our staff's job isn't to make a decision. It's to maximize the quality of each nonprofit's application. So that's a conversation. We help prioritize which grant programs make the most sense. We'll be really honest when there's not a good fit. And then we let the nonprofit put its best foot forward, and then usually, in fact, always with our competitive programs, there is then a committee, non-staff committee, that reviews all the applications and makes the ultimate decisions. So it's a journey. Sometimes foundations get accused of being slow, and I would agree with that. We have structure for a reason. Our structure is intended to make sure that we're staying true to the by the people philosophy, that we're letting nonprofits participate, that we have an objective as possible process to give the money away. But that does mean for a typical grant program, we'll take applications. It's a multi-month program where if you're sitting down with me as an individual donor, I may walk out of the room already having committed support for you. And so there are downsides to working with foundations, and nonprofits quickly decide whether it's worth their time or not once they get a taste for it.
And that's interesting, and I guess the assumption with the Ann Arbor Area Foundation is that the focus of the philanthropic endeavor should be local in its scope. Is that right?
And to be more specific, you keyed in on the Ann Arbor area phrase. So we define Ann Arbor area as Washtenaw County. Yeah.
And then what may be helpful for people to realize is that because this is citizens of Ann Arbor since 1963 that have actually contributed to this, we've got various endowed aspects of this from concerned citizens. Could you give us an example of just a couple of local organizations that have directly benefited from their interaction with your foundation that you are quite pleased with the results of what's happened? That might be helpful for people to get a sense of.
Sure, and of course the challenge with naming one or two organizations is the 20 or 30 I'm not naming, right?
Right.
But let me name two that have really intriguing stories, and by no means am I claiming the foundation was the sole source of success.
Sure.
But there's two stories I always like to share. One is was the Sphinx organization. A gentleman named Aaron Dworkin had a vision that there weren't enough people of color in the classical music, and started a nonprofit whose goal was to create more diversity within classical orchestral music. The very first institutional grant ever received by that organization was from the Ann Arbor Area Community Foundation. Now, Aaron and then his wife Afa went on to make this literally an internationally renowned organization. There's performances in Carnegie Hall every year. Aaron was named, received one of the MacArthur Genius Grants.
Wow.
Obviously, there were a lot of people who made that a success, but we take great pride in being there at the very beginning. Another story that may hit closer to home is the Neutral Zone, which a lot of folks in this area have heard of. Again, founded through a lot of generous donors, but we certainly, the foundation played an important role in initial support as well as transitional support at critical times in that organization's history. And I'm really excited because the Neutral Zone recently established a dedicated nonprofit endowment. So Jim, you and I have been talking about competitive grants, which is primarily how we distribute money. We have over 100 dedicated nonprofit endowments where we set up a fund that is dedicated to one organization. And And what we do is we take the money, invest it with all of the other assets that we have. So we can invest in a way no nonprofit alone can invest. And then we distribute some of the proceeds every year back to that nonprofit. So what the neutral zone created through establishing that fund is an annuity, basically, a perpetual source of revenue. And as their donors grow that fund, they have a baseline of growing income. So that's a really cool story because we were there with them in the early years, we've supported them along the way, and now they came to us and said it was time to take that next step and create a permanent fund dedicated to them.
Well, that's great to see.
Isn't that cool?
It's a wonderful development. Well, I'm kind of interested then, you've been involved in nonprofit now for a few years.
Yeah.
But then there also, with any organization, any challenges come along. And I guess my thought would be, let's take it from a larger overall view of threats or maybe challenges, concerns that you see as in the nonprofit philanthropic sector as a whole, that you see as a result of just changing times, or concerns or worries you have of the future in the sector as a whole that you see could be challenged. Maybe a challenge is a better word than threat. So what do you see as a major challenge in the nonprofit sector, let's say the next 5 years or so?
Sure. So I see several. Now, of course, in the back of my mind are all the solutions, right, which is where always my head goes. One is, and this one people may not appreciate until you start talking about it, there's been a lot of talk about income inequality in the country, and definitely happening in Washtenaw County as well. That effect actually holds true in philanthropy as well. So national data and local data show that more and more philanthropy is emanating from fewer and fewer people. So philanthropy is slowly becoming less of a participatory process for a lot of middle-class individuals who maybe 20 years ago saw a lot of reasons and had the capacity to support nonprofits in addition to everything else that they were doing. And so it's a concern of ours because we support hundreds of nonprofits every year. Those nonprofits depend greatly on broad giving by a lot of individuals. If the data is an indicator, what's going to happen over the next 5 years is there are going to be fewer and fewer individuals giving to nonprofits, and so our market is shrinking, if you will. And the other thing I'll mention is the tax law changes that Congress passed have accelerated that effect because of the doubling of the standard deduction. And there's a lot of arguments, which I agree with, why that's good. But an effect that the nonprofit sector is concerned about is that actually reduces the motivation to give because fewer people are itemizing their tax returns. So you could say that's a good thing, but what that means is we're going to see that's going to accelerate a reduction in giving by the middle class because there's no longer that direct tangible tax benefit for every itemized gift that they make. So this trend was already happening, Jim, before the tax law was passed, I want to be clear, but we're going to see that accelerate the trend. And so that's certainly one area of worry. And then another area of worry, and I'm going to get more local now, is we're expecting more and more of the nonprofit sector. We're expecting them to be transformational, and let's not just feed someone, let's solve hunger. Let's not just give someone access to a doctor, let's look at the social determinants of health that got them to that clinic in the first place. The challenge is the nonprofit sector doesn't have the capital, or in other words, the scale to be transformative, and that is not the fault of the nonprofit sector. The reality is we expect an outsized return on what's a relatively modest investment, and here's how it illustrated. The state of Michigan's annual budget is around $60 billion, I think, the proposed one. You could liquidate every foundation in the state of Michigan, Kellogg and Kresge and Mott, gigantic, foundations that are among the biggest in the world. If you sold every dollar of asset of all of them and us, we couldn't fund the state of Michigan for half a year. So that points to a really huge difference in scale. The government has the scale to make major change, but of course is constrained in a lot of ways. People then turn to the nonprofit sector and say, break us through, find those innovations and transformations. But the challenge is we don't have the capital necessary to truly be innovative at the scale that people expect. And as that expectation grows, I think folks are going to have to come to terms with, are we going to increase our investments in the sector while individual giving may go down because of the tax law changes and income inequality. And so there's sort of this these intractable tensions. And I'm not saying this is the end of the sector by no stretch. It's a durable sector. But I think we're going to have to come to terms with what the role of the sector should be going forward.
Well, and I think that would be my comment to that. And ironically, you were mentioning that because of we are the greatest givers in the world as it relates to philanthropy and charities. The Europeans have a different history, but then people would argue, well, if you're going to give benefits, if you're not going to give me my benefits for my deductions of my taxes, why don't you let the government do it? Which apparently is an issue. If the resources, it is definitely a strain on the non-side, because and I'm sure this was the case, if it really is, it is an issue related to the standardized deduction. I mean, that's a major major issue. Now, how was this? Was this when this was proposed? Was this an issue that you were raising, or the sector was raising, that this could hurt you? How did? I'm just surprised that it really is it almost forces at one level the government to do more by virtue of taking more money out of your sector. And I'm just it seems like how that was done so. Maybe it was a long time in coming. I don't know how this happened, or what you think.
How I would characterize it is so first of all, to directly answer the question, there are national groups that represent the nonprofit sector that certainly were in D.C. along with thousands of other lobbyists. And what I'd observe in being, so I'm one of the vice chairs for the Council of Michigan Foundations. It's a great collection of hundreds of foundations in Michigan, and we do have a presence in Washington, D.C. as well to look out for federal policy that either enables or are barriers to the sector. So my observation is the questions you posed were not top of mind. As everyone watching knows, there are a lot of issues rolled into these tax law changes, and I'm not going to speak to those, but what I'll observe is the effect on the charitable sector was not a high priority for anybody. And so in some sense, it wasn't an unintended and unknown consequence, but it wasn't a consequence that was on the radars of the lawmakers pushing this through. And I'm talking about both sides of the aisle. And so this was simply an effect of the tax law changes. And so now, of course, there's a lot of dialogue at the federal level of, well, should we introduce universal tax credits for tax donations or other mechanisms, or maybe universal deductibility regardless of the standard deduction of tax donations? And so I do hope that over the next few years, there'll be more recognition of the important role of philanthropy in helping the government achieve its goals, and that's key. That's why we have a philanthropic sector. It's one of the reasons. So I'm cautiously optimistic that over the next few years, maybe we'll see some federal policy fixes that address some of these pretty significant outcomes that will create a lower revenue stream for a sector that already doesn't get enough funding.
And that is interesting. And I guess then the final question for you is that you've been leading this organization now for 8 years? How many?
CEO for 4. I've been with the foundation for 8.
So let's go back to this 5-year thing. I I've been using this with other guests too, but what do you hope to accomplish in the next 5 years? Assuming you're staying there, or maybe you have other plans, but let's assume you're staying.
Yeah.
What would you like to say if you came back on the show in 5 years? This is where I have the organization today, and this is where I would like to see where it will be in 5 years. What would be your specific goals you'd like to achieve in the next 5 years at the AACF?
Sure, it's a great question, and actually I'm not going to avoid the question, but I'm going to answer with a different lens, which is what I'd like to see 5 years from now is that our community is thriving, that it's better off than it was today, that fewer people are experiencing health issues, that fewer people are experiencing homelessness or food insecurity. And of course, we're not going to have nirvana in 5 years, but if we can turn around and say that it is more people are waking up optimistic about their days 5 years from now, the foundation won't be the sole cause, but I'd like for us to be a part of that kind of really methodical, step-by-step improvement. Because if we keep improving in that trajectory, eventually we do get to a place where we've significantly put a dent in hunger, in homelessness, in health issues, in inequities, in education, all of those areas. And so I don't mean to deflect your question, but as a community foundation, we're involved in every aspect of charitable activity you can imagine. And so while, of course, as CEO, my job is to make sure the organization is strong and thriving, at the end of the day, unless we're effecting positive community change, there's really no point to our organization. So everything we're working on now, some of that work will continue for the next 5 years, some of it we may phase out, but all with the question in our mind, how can we maximize the impact of every dollar we distribute through grants, scholarships, and now loans, so that more people are thriving and fewer people are suffering in Washtenaw County.
Neel Hajra, thank you for being a guest on A2 Insight.
Thanks, Jim.
And for A2 Insight, until next time, I'm James Trost.